everyone. It's Mary Jane here again with a hymn for you. This week we're going to talk about Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. From the sources I looked at, it's one of the most 10 popular hymns, at least according to hymnary.org. And there's a lot known about the author of that penned the words to this hymn. And I'm just going to jump in by saying it's very interesting doing research on especially the known composers and poets of these hymns, because when I delve into the research, you can see a very clear, just a very wide variety of stories based on the fundamentalist versus liberal Christians and kind of various versions in between, kind of like how we often interpret the Bible in different ways depending on what denomination we're from. So this is one of those stories that was really loved by pretty conservative evangelical Christians, and so the author, what I'm mostly going to talk about is who wrote the text, and that is Robert Robinson. Here he is. And he was born in England in 1735, and so he was still part of the, he was still in that beginnings of when Methodism was forming, and he was kind of a part of that beginning of the Great Awakening in the Americas, because he was influenced by the great George Whitefield. And so this is kind of where the crux of the story happens. So he was, his father died at an early age, some say 5, some say 8, and they didn't have much money. And so he was apprenticed with a barber in London, I believe, yep. And so his mother sent him off maybe when he was about 14. So this is where the interesting story comes, and some people say that at this time he lived a debauched life, and he ran with the gangs and the hoodlums, and he was just really a lost young man. And then when he was 20, 17 or 20, yeah, I think when he was 20, he heard George Whitefield preach. Now, I did a little bit of research about George Whitefield, and he is quite an influential man. They say that he preached over 18,000 sermons in his life, and then they even said that George Whitefield could be heard over 500 feet away. Benjamin Franklin measured once when he was preaching how far out, and then he figured out that in one preaching you could hear 30,000 people could hear him. And so they say that his influence of people that heard his sermons was in the millions, because he started in England and then he moved over to the Americas. So in any case, if you're looking for a little more interesting tidbits, look up George Whitefield. He's one of the cornerstones of Christian faith and influenced in the Methodism at the beginning. Anyway, sidebar. So Robert was so influenced by this great orator. They say George was just an incredible orator. If you can imagine being able to hear him from over a football field away. And he was, for about 3 years, he just kept thinking about this preaching, which probably, by most accounts, was kind of a hellfire and damnation sermon, where he was almost haunted by it. And they say that 3 years after that he was converted. And he began a life of ministry. And so he started in a Methodist church. Let's see if I can find. At the Calvinist Methodist Chapel in Mindenhall. And then about 1759, then he actually moved to St. Andrew's Baptist Church. So he started as a Methodist, but then he ended up as a Baptist. And they talk about in his theology, he really believed in not the sprinkle or the infant baptism, but the adult full baptism of conversion. So that's probably why he ended up in a Baptist church and not a Methodist church. So he penned this text when he was only about 23, so probably soon after he had been converted. And I want to talk a little bit about the text, and then I'll talk a little bit about the tune, and see if I forgot anything else about old Robert. So first off, I want to say that in the second verse, maybe many of you remember that it says, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer." Now, when I was a little girl, I would sing that and I would be like, who in the world is Ebenezer? And all I could ever think about was Ebenezer Scrooge. And that's the only Ebenezer I ever knew. But I just couldn't figure out why we were singing, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come." So if you are wondering the same as me, because I couldn't quite even remember to this day until I re-researched it, what Ebenezer means. So that is specifically based on 1 Samuel 7:12, in which the prophet Samuel raises a stone as a monument saying, "Hitherto hath the Lord helped us." And so the English transliteration kind of has Samuel naming the stone Ebenezer, or so it's kind of like the stone of help. So it's usually shown in these lyrics, but it's such weird lyrics that there's many hymnals that kind of try to change the lyrics for that. In fact, I looked up on the Methodist history, and with the last, either the 89 hymnal or the 89 hymnal, I think, they tried to come up with a different word to fit in there because of the issue of what in the world is Ebenezer. But they couldn't find one, and so they left it in there. And so if you're ever wondering, it's the stone of help. So next time we sing that, you'll know. The tune is, if you can guess, if you remember, if you happen to watch my Shape Note episode on What Wondrous Love, it is it appears in the Sacred Harp. It didn't originate from the Sacred Harp, but it's one of those tunes that really goes well with, those great camp revival meetings. And so it's found in some of the Sacred Harp Shape Note hymnals, but it's also, it's called Nettleton, and that's the tune, and here we are. I apologize. Oh, John Wyeth. He wrote the tune, and he was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and so it was definitely part of this Great Awakening in the Americas. So the tune came from the 18th century in the Americas. And I think that's important to note because it really sounds like an American kind of folk tune. And so I think this, the power of this hymn is that we have the American folk tune, which brings us to those great camp revival meetings, and then the Englishman who was greatly influenced by this huge camp, George Whitefield, who became one of the big preachers of the Great Awakening. So is really strongly in that old camp meeting feel, and probably is why it's so popular as a hymn, because it probably is sung all throughout the South and all throughout the North, being a hymn that probably spans both conservative to liberal Christians and denominations. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of it. I'm trying to think if I forgot anything. Apologize. There was a lot of, oh, yes, I knew there's one other thing. So like I was saying, that there's like a lot of different stories about it, depending on, what sort of brand of Christianity you are. So there's this story, which I don't know if it's true, but it is really grabbed on by especially evangelical Christians, because Robert Robinson, the poet of the words, one thing I didn't mention was that particularly in his really later life, he kind of started researching ideas from the Unitarian Church. And of course, if he was a Baptist preacher and he started toying with Unitarian ideals, that was not a good thing. And so there's a story that Robinson was one day riding a stagecoach when he noticed a woman deeply engrossed with a hymn book. During an ensuing conversation, the lady turned to Robinson and asked what he thought of this hymn she was humming. Robinson burst into tears and said, "Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man who wrote that hymn many years ago, and I would give 1,000 worlds, if I had them, to enjoy the feelings I had then." And so I think that probably, if this story is true, and if he did say that, I wonder if, after you've studied Christianity for so long, I think that there only become more questions and things become less clear, kind of like the wonder and the mystery. When you're young, it's easier to believe in kind of a black and white God. And as we grow in our faith and learn more about the Bible and Christ and theology, then we start questioning ourselves. And I wonder if that statement that he said was maybe more of just wishing that he could feel, the definitive knowledge of, that surety that he had when he was young and wrote this hymn. Now, the conservatives, especially the evangelicals, say that, that he just, as he was older, he just, he lost Christ and he fell away from Christ. And so the story is him wishing that he could find Christ once again. And in fact, I watched a music video where they kind of played out that scenario in present day with an old kind of haggard man on a bus with a woman singing this tune to him, and him saying that, well, that's the tune that I composed once, if only I could feel that again. So it's kind of an interesting story to think about, and what really happened, I don't know that it's not really clear. So we can only suppose if that did happen and what that was. But he definitely was an influential preacher and a theologian, and so that's how we get this hymn today. Anyway, enough of that. Let's now go ahead and sing the hymn. It's on page 400 in the United Methodist hymnal, and I'll play it through, and then please sing with me.
life and